Awesome. So yeah, thanks again for carving out some time to do this. This morning I merged the branch in Figma for the typography updates. So I'm in the midst of kind of I think I typed out a like a read only on the UX Weekly for that and linked back to the number 1413 issue in pajamas on the changes, but yeah, we can pick up with some of the items that we didn't get to last time. And let's see here. Any other thoughts before we jump into that?
Nope, you're good to go.
Awesome. All right. So text styles in Figma. So we went ahead, the update that I just mentioned, we put together and we kept things pretty one-to-one as with where they were as far as uh, defaults. So we didn't change anything with like the alert headings or the drawer per se, other than making maybe some minor adjustments. But we've currently been discussing it looks like three different things in there, which is like how to present sensible defaults. And what I mean by that is our designers start with Excel, excuse me, and so a larger breakpoint. Very rarely are they designing smaller initially, if at all. That's a topic for another time, but being able to have sensible defaults so that when they arrive at a file, use the styles, they know what they're getting out of the box immediately. The second part is addressing component specific heading styles. So alerts, uh, in fact, I could probably just share that quick here. All right, go to component library. So an alert, for example, has this heading style, which I'd recommend being semantically an H2. However, right here, style-wise, we have UI label bold. If I were to change this to an actual H2, it'd be much larger. And I think that we want to have the correct semantics, but also address component specific styles. And we're going to run into this with cards. We're going to have this with drawers and then banner. And so being able to have kind of a maybe abstract out what we need to do for those so that we can have component specific heading styles that somehow map back to the the original and why we're doing the change. And then the last point would be to communicate dynamic size changes. And for example, if in a banner, when we are using like the dynamic type scale, if I were to, decrease the size of this, that heading would theoretically be smaller as well based on the dynamic scaling. And so how do we represent that in Figma so that if a designer takes this component and resizes it, they know that A, the heading should update, or B, they have instances of it at different breakpoints. And we've had some ideas on that, but we can go into that a little more. So, all right, so designers use that breakpoint by default. There's only three components that are that make use of headings that would be impacted by the type styles. Uh, and then I mentioned, yeah, abstracting those component headings. So this point, more on the abstraction would be perhaps maybe we can do something where banner, alert, and drawer, for example, all use the same abstracted heading, right? Where we do something where it's like component H2, or that's kind of probably a silly name, but something along those lines where it's abstracted, but we understand that there's some properties that change based on it being in a component, so that we can not have a excuse me, a drawer H2 and a banner H2 and an alert H2, but we would have a way to have those be shared. Um, all right. And Pedro, you would like some visual examples. So uh, I don't know if any of those satisfied that, but are there others that would be helpful?
Yeah, I think what I was wondering is how abstracting a universal component heading would look, because you mentioned an alert heading would be an H2, but it doesn't have the same style or dynamic scaling that the default heading 2 does. And I'm not really understanding the difference. I mean, in Figma specifically. So that's why I was asking for some visual examples of what you meant.
All right.
So maybe to add some context. So what we currently do in the product, and we actually do that very often, is we use like a semantic H2, for example, but then we slap a class H4 or H5 or H3 or whatever on it, so that the semantically H2 looks like a visual H3 to H whatever, right? And to bypass basically what we're, what we're currently doing is, and we know that if you use an H2 in a component, the heading will be, too big if you use just like the regular H2 we have. So the idea was that we have like a component-based H2, which has a smaller given size. So that we can, whenever you semantically have to use an H2 in a component, like this specific styled H2 would apply. Does that maybe help to give you some context?
Yeah, it does. Okay, because because you were talking about H2 in Figma, we don't have that semantic, so I wasn't understanding why or how would you have that. But yeah, I understand that it's when the component is then put in the product, the element would be an H2. and um, and then it says a bit up that today there are only 3 components that make use of headings. Are all of those, would all of those be semantic H2s, and are all of them using the same visual style in Figma?
That I think that's a good question. I think it's to be determined. I know that specifically for alerts, we'd recommend an H2 based on kind of the fact that alerts pop in, they have their own section. If somebody was navigating via heading in a screen reader, having the alert be closer to the top of that priority, I think would make sense. Banner is potentially similar. It's another section within the page, so I think that those two connect. Drawer to me gets a little fuzzy, but I would also, drawer might be similar. It depends on how close we get to modals with this. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, modal actually has headers as well. So that's another one that could be looped in there. And both of those, it kind of depends on your paradigm with it. I've seen recommendations that say, hey, you know what, when you open a modal, which a drawer effectively is a modal under the hood, it's just different styling and position, but very similar semantics and behavior. When you open that, it's like opening another document. So you can do an H1. I've heard that argument, but I think there's also arguments for no, it's a subset of what you're viewing. So it's still within the page. So it's an H2. So some of that we would have to kind of suss out, but I think that it could be possible to align on a style, and then even to Sascha's point, it's abstracted enough that it could apply to any semantic heading level, but it's just in the context of a component, right? So it would all look the same, but under the hood there might be a different weight, and in that way, that abstraction allows us to make it reused as much as possible. But it would take some design exercises to align those headings and decide, like, are those dynamic, like the rest of the type scale, like should a modal heading scale, should an alert heading scale? We'd have to sort through a lot of those things, but for now, it's just tying that back so that, you know, if a designer today goes and they use an alert and then you know, they hand this off and a developer goes to inspect this and they're like, oh, that's just bold text. That semantic meaning isn't going to be carried through. So what we really want to do is be able to say, okay, this is an H2. So upon inspection, okay, I see that semantically this should be an H2, and being able to kind of to help connect the dots in that way so that our design intent isn't lost in translation or handoff. So
Yeah, I don't know if it is the Figma text style. I don't know if it is the Figma text style responsibility to communicate the semantic, and if we're relying on the name of the Figma text style or something like that to say which HTML elements should be used, I don't know if we're trying too hard to use just very few communication elements. So I don't know if it's better to, in those cases, just to really, you know, type it out and say like this is visually would use the I don't know, H2 class, but it's actually an H4 or an H1 or whatever. So and about the dynamic scaling, if we're talking about, you know, for example, an alert heading in the product implemented, if it would have dynamic scaling or not, I don't see why it shouldn't have. I don't know if that's what you're talking about here, the dynamic scaling in the product, or if it's allowing designers to change the scale in Figma.
yeah, speaking specifically to the end result in the product.
Yeah. So I don't see why it would be different, or else you would start having a lot of exceptions, I guess, because you're designing the UI type scale, which is dynamic, but then you're saying, oh, you know, but these UI components, they use the fixed type scale
But
or something.
here's an example why is because a modal, just for one, if a modal is set to this size, its container is not scaling, and so you're fitting a larger heading into the same space. Similar with a drawer, where if a drawer's sizes, you know, a drawer is always this width, that container of a drawer is not scaling, and so because of that, that heading, if it was dynamic, its proportion to the rest of the content or to the you know, to the rest of it could just bump up against that confined space, right? And that's where like container queries would be really helpful in the future, I think. Drawer, I you know, I would lean more towards dynamic, and that being because of how we're using it, where there could actually be static content with other heading levels in there. But something like a modal, that was kind of the thinking, is like, this doesn't change scale. Alerts can do both. They're both fixed and they scale and they're in content. So perhaps an argument can be made that those should be dynamic because they are adapting to the content as well. So, so I could see that. I wanted to, so I guess that, all that being said, I would probably align with you about the no reason for them to not be dynamic, at least by default, right? And
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
But I wanted to touch on
And then
the.
if we have a
Go ahead.
strong reason, you know, to make them fixed, we would make it. I'm just thinking that it might introduce more more friction in the design process and in implementation by having these different things. Whereas if you're able to contain and say, you know, the fixed scale is for, you know, user generated content or markdown or however you want to contain it, and everything else is the dynamic, I think it greatly simplifies things. And but yeah, you know, just I think anyway, we should experiment.
Yeah, because it depends too on where we want the simplicity. Because if I'm a designer and I use a drawer, if I put this drawer in a a small window, uh, then that means all these headings need to change. And if I
Yeah,
put it in a large window, then all these headings need to change, regardless of the drawer sizing. It's based on the container around it, and so
yeah,
we have to provide that for a designer to have. Whereas if we just said, hey, drawer always uses fixed, then wherever you put a drawer as a designer, you don't have to worry about any of it. And so from a design standpoint, it's probably easier to do fixed. Same with alert, because it's like, this heading's the same regardless of the scale. Even modal, it again, modal, it's like, well, the heading's not going to change based on the width of the modal that you've chosen, but it's actually the width of the container that it's in that I think adds quite a bit of design complexity. So, and then when we talk about handoff, there's more room for error because a designer is providing this at a static point where in the product it's not going to be. And so trying to communicate those could be a challenge. So that's why we're trying to figure out where do we place the weight and how do we want to implement this in a way that that would be most helpful. Because to your point, and feel
I
free to interrupt
actually
here.
just I want to say I actually like that complexity, or the fact that not so much complexity. I like the fact that it is dynamic by nature, and designers don't have control over every pixel. And because you don't know how long a modal title will be. Some of them will be short, others will be long. The same thing in a drawer and in an alert, likewise. And then you have translations as well. And if the argument for fixed is so that designers can control it better, and then when they hand it off, it looks as they designed. I think that is not in favor of more elasticity in the design process, and baking that into what you're designing, and knowing that you can't control all of the variables. I don't know, but that's that's usually how I like to work. So
Yeah, I I I think that's a great angle to come at it. I think in the back of my mind, I still think of the fact that the component itself has its own purpose and intent. And so letting your, I've got a fluid width viewport and the drawer is way over here on this massive monitor. Like the drawer's purpose is still the same. So should and its width is still the same. So should all those headings be larger and force everything down the scroll? So that's where I come at it too, is also like the component intent. Are we intending that content to scale like all the other content might in a flow would be, so
well,
it's
in
not so
that
much. Yeah.
yeah, in that case, I would argue that maybe we should revisit the container width for drawers. Like if you have one of those like panoramic, this is an extreme example, but if you have like a panoramic monitor, really wide monitor, would the drawer have exactly the same width as if you're in a much smaller desktop monitor. Maybe not.
Yeah, I think as we have defined them today, it would, because we have controls like this where if we start to stretch those out a little bit, all of a sudden we're losing relationships between like what is helpful. It makes it a little harder to track things, uh, or we get into the argument of like line length and whatnot. So I think there's a lot of, that's where like once you start giving those components that freedom, it adds a lot of complexity to the design process. But part of this too, and I wanted to go back to this point about, you don't know that it's up to Textiles and Figma to communicate the semantics. So I'm curious, one of the shortcomings I see us having is the design handoff process where like accessibility annotations, any other design intent annotations, like you mentioned, like just marking it as like, hey, this is an H4, but it's under the hood. It's really should be an H2. I don't see designers doing that today, and I don't see any of our design tooling help to fill the gap. And that's what I'm aiming to do, is to help have that design tooling that we have available fill that gap. But I'm wondering like what, because we don't have those annotations, I don't see that handing off. Like I think we've seen kind of the result of that in some areas of the product where heading levels aren't following a flow, or it's implemented per the design, but then the semantics are completely misaligned with the DOM and the hierarchy. So I guess that's where I'm getting at too, with Figma being able to help translate that.
Mm-hmm.
So like maybe some of your thoughts on that, and then how have you coached designers or yourself to provide annotations or to provide that communication? Because maybe my last point on this is it goes back to something I brought up in other scenarios, is that we don't do a lot of requirements gathering or documentation on requirements. Like, okay, here's the construct of the thing we're building. It needs to have this as a structure. And so I'm wondering how that is communicated when it comes to development, and how it's even understood by a designer to begin with, that, oh, this should be an H2, this should be an H3, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it starts off by the fact that I don't think we have a good understanding and a good documentation of our layouts, maybe. So I'll start there with I'm calling them layouts. We've had this discussion about the terminology. I don't, templates, layouts, just however you want to call them, but in a way that you could say, you know what I'm talking about. Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
In a way that you could say, for this layout, know that the H1 would always be this. And then from then on, you would need to have an H2 here, and then you have a sidebar, and there you would have an H3 or another H2. So I think because we don't have that, it leaves a lot of room for interpretation of how you're going to, what will be in the product, and how it's going to be implemented. When I've designed, it has been a while here at GitLab, when I've designed, new pages from scratch that have, 1, 2, or 3 headings. I try to document that, and even if it's not using for example, the H1 style, let's imagine, I would say, hey, this is actually an H2, but it's using an H1 or vice versa. So I made sure to document that. Usually I've documented that in the issue itself, because I that I've realized that usually that's where developers pay the most attention, not so much in Figma. But I may be wrong. That might be my experience. I noticed that if the requirements are there, they're more likely to follow that as the single source of truth than what is in Figma, because it's an external tool and they're jumping between the issue and the merge request and their IDE, and so yeah. So yeah, that I think that's my experience, and I've tried to, whenever I'm reviewing merge requests, I've tried to be on the lookout for those things. So not only the the ARIA roles and other things that we want to make sure are accessible. If there's text that is only there for screen readers, but it is visually hidden. And then also the headings, if we're using the proper markup for it. And usually it's really easy because, as Sascha was saying, we just say to the engineer, hey, can you swap this for that element, that heading element, but keep that class, and it's really easy. The visual style is the same, nothing breaks, it's just changing the HTML element. But going back to your point of, okay, so how can we solve this? How can we make sure that there is a good communication and that things are implemented properly? I think I would start with a good documentation on the layouts, and maybe even before that, if it is easier, on how we think about the headings at GitLab, and when it is appropriate, for example, to break from the main document flow and have a separate document inside the document where you can reset the heading level or something like that. And ultimately, I think, or at least as a designer, I would expect that for the base components, when I'm not designing headings from scratch and I'm just basically using an alert or using this or that, or even form components, that the headings would be treated, and that everything would be already in GitLab UI. So I wouldn't have to communicate that it would be working from scratch. But of course, whenever you're designing a new page, and for example, it's a new settings page or something like that, you have to rely on a certain, certain hierarchy and levels. And to that, I think it goes back to my point of, what if we had some documentation of, hey, you're starting a new settings page and you're designing that from scratch. This is usually the hierarchy and the kinds of heading styles and heading elements that we use here. Or if you're starting to design a new, integrations page, which maybe would be similar to a settings page, here's what you would do. Or so, yeah, I think I would try to solve that with documentation for the layouts and properly implemented components. I think that would help.
That's awesome. That's helpful. I just realized that I wasn't even sharing my screen, so I was going back and forth into Figma when
Okay.
pulling up the models and all that, and I thought it was on screen. So I apologize if that was not in there. Yeah, that's helpful. I agree. Yeah, with the new pajamas update, there is a section for page templates, and we don't have that even visible yet, and that's because there aren't any yet. And so I want to get there to help have the concept of the page structure and also capture some of those templates. And then one of the other things that we've talked about, I think last time, was some visual examples. I think you had highlighted that as a kind of a takeaway the last time in the document, so that we have some use cases represented with the type scale. And I know we're planning on doing that as well, having showing some of the breakpoints demonstrating that. So I hope to capture some of that too. So I think that's good. Sascha, did you have anything else there, or should we jump over to the typeface issues? Because I feel like that's
Agree.
super helpful, Pedro, and I think we have like some.
Yeah.
I appreciate that because and I want to be clear too. I don't want Figma to be like the end all. Like you design it, you hand it off, and everything's annotated in there, right? But I want to make sure that whatever we build, doesn't detract from that flow, but also can supplement it in a meaningful way. So.
No, I
Yeah.
totally agree. Also, like what Pedro said is very helpful, and I agree with all the points. So I think we can move on from my point of view.
Okay. Sascha, did you want to go into the typeface issues?
Yes. So we just have like experienced some, or like our users have experienced some issues with like the typeface changes. Most of them were based on Windows machines. So having clear type on, for example, can lead to some rendering issues at smaller font sizes, especially at 14 pixels, for example. IP and I both looked into that. There seems to be like a hinted version of Inter, which actually enables the clear type feature, which the main font does not. So we're currently looking into, if this should be like the sensible default, at least for the product to use the hinted version of Inter, or that we built on top of that for our GitLab Science. But actually, to this point, there was like positive feedback if we would go with that. And now, just like 10 minutes or like 5 minutes ago, another user posted that if we would use that font, the experience for him would be terrible. So maybe it comes back to opinions, so yeah, we will have to see. I'm still planning on having my hands on a 1080p display because like this issue only affects Windows machines on low res screens. So when I spin up like a virtual machine on my Mac, or even if I go to my gaming PC, which runs on Windows, I cannot actually see the issues. So it actually is only on low res screens and not high res screens, and I only have a 4K screen at home, so I cannot, reproduce the issue. Same goes for IP. But I have a collab just down the road, and they have some old 1080p screens, so I still plan to go there and have a look at one of those screens, so that we maybe can just verify the issue and see if the hinted version would actually be solving that issue. So that's the Windows blurriness. It shouldn't affect Linux, Pedro. As far as we're aware, we can do some testing on different distros as well, but from the type of feedback we got, it's all Windows machines at this point. But it's a very good point. We have to double check on Linux as well. But they use a different rendering engine on Linux than on Windows. It's not using clear type, so it should be fine. But yeah, let's verify that as well.
I can check on Chrome as well. I think both of two of my kids have Chromebooks with maybe 1080p, so can invest that. I did see another comment come through today on the same topic of the blurriness. So
yeah, it's a bit of back and forth. So some users report it's better with the hinted version, and then another user reports it's worse with the hinted version. It's like a
yeah,
Yeah, I think we have to verify it on our own. You know, just to see if the rendering does make any difference in terms of readability at smaller sizes. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, yeah, that feedback's, it's valid. It's unfortunate that's that's happening. I wonder too if we can investigate even potentially some media queries that might be able to tap into something like that so that we can serve up something different if needed, um, either based on resolution or if a certain feature is enabled.
yes, there is like the media query in CSS actually has a density property. So this could be potentially be something we could do, that we you know, use the hinted version only if you have like a lower density screen, for example. We could also detect if it's actually only you know, affecting Windows machines. We could also detect if it's, you know, if the operating system would be Windows or not, and then serving different font files there. Or if there's no real downside to just using the hinted version on all other platforms, we could just, you know, opt for going for that a specific variant. You know, like the information I got from IP is just like the hinted version is a bit bigger because it has all the clear type hints in it, which like the main font just stripped away in terms of file size. So that might be the only downside of using it for all the systems, because it only, at, you know, at least what we know, it only affects Windows machines. So, but yeah, it's a very good point, Jeremy.
So providing a user setting to fall back to system fonts, that's something that we've also, it's been brought up. Uh, it's kind of, this is an interesting one because we have the web IDE settings, which I think should remain independent probably. There could be some overlap if we connected them, but I wouldn't want to make it a web IDE preference change and then have that propagate to the product. Like I might want to go the other way, like holistically everything in GitLab, you know, goes this way, but probably not upstream. Um, one of the reasons we did the type change to begin with was I can't remember how I phrased it in the blog post, but what we're able to do with one font is we're able to focus on many enhancements. Whereas if it's all system fonts, we have like limited options to work with because we can't get in and tweak that. We can't adjust the font weight, for example, when we're using system fonts as granularly as we can now. So going back, you know, the system font route, I think it's a it gets us back potentially into the place where some UI elements are just going to be wonky because your system font or whatever, you know, like the line height, the baseline, and we're not going to be able to control that. Like that's a problem today. But Sascha, I'll let you get into your question. Sorry, I don't want to ramble on that.
Yeah, so, you know, this was just like also out of a discussion that I had with IP regarding like all the feedback we gathered so far. You know, if we should, or at least there's now an issue for, you know, like making making just a preference for the monospace font. I feel that people, especially our user base, is more opinionated towards the monospace font. That was also like 95% or even more than 95% of the feedback in the fonts issue is regarding the monospace font and not like the UI font or like the sans serif font, right? So I know that, you know, like you either love JetBrains Mono or you really hate it. And I think like most of the feedback comes from people who really dislike JetBrains Mono, right? And giving them like, you know, like a chance to change back to like the default font for their monospaced, like, you know, like everything code related might be something we can easily provide. You know, it shouldn't cost us much of engineering power to do that, especially Jeremy, you already mentioned it, that the IDE team also wants to do the same. So they also changed to use you know, JetBrains Mono as default, but they also want to have like a fallback to Menlo, which is like on most system, the you know, like the monospace system font. But we would, you know, there was also like feedback, okay, let's give us the chance to choose our own font. But I would say this would, for me, this would be a full stop in only providing, you know, like our default, which would be JetBrains Mono, and then just one option to fall back to system font. I wouldn't open the rabbit hole of, you know, like just giving the option to do whatever, because I can already see a lot of issues open that the font doesn't work. Maybe browsers at some point don't support loading local fonts anymore. I think there's such an initiative actually going on for at least Firefox for now. So yeah, I wouldn't, you know, like going down that rabbit hole. So that's my 5 cents.
Awesome. I'll try to be brief. I think my take, like if we did any kind of settings, I would just start with monospaced. And so my conclusion would be like, let's optimize for GitLab Sans as absolutely much as we can. That's really where we're gonna be able to do a lot with the UI and push it forward in the ways that we want to. And provide a monospace preference. And Pedro, if you don't mind me skipping you really quick, I was just gonna suggest that we could explore other monofaced fonts still. So one of the things I tried to emphasize in the blog post, I don't know how clear it was that this is just a baseline, right? By us getting alignment on type, it's going to allow us to fix so many other issues. So the chosen typeface itself isn't really what it comes down to. And so, you know, like updating to a different monospace font in the future, if we did that, we've already done this other groundwork to allow us to have fonts and to clean up things, right? By changing the font, we see where there's breakage in the product versus GitLab UI versus whatever. So we still have some room to do that and iterate on that as well. So I think that's maybe a separate topic, but Pedro, you linked to an issue there that's helpful.
Yeah, just it's a 2-year-old issue about custom monospace font. It doesn't, I don't think it has any votes. I think so when we had the system fonts, I think it was more or less, I don't know if it is written anywhere, but I think it was general assumption was that we would support all system fonts, or would try to support all system fonts. So if you're in a Linux distribution that uses one font, but then you're in Windows and it uses another font, and whenever people brought up issues with their system fonts, we would try to address them. If they were using custom fonts, we would say, you know, that's a custom font. So I think regardless of what we do here, I think we need to have a stance on how much we would support things, because in this case, right now, we only have Inter and JetBrains Mono, and I'm assuming that that's the only fonts that we would support. Like if someone else has a a CSS you know, override to use custom fonts, we wouldn't support it. If we're opening the door to fall back to system fonts or even custom fonts or more, I think we need to be clear on how much, if we would support them or not, basically. An issue with the custom fonts, and we had that as well with the system fonts, is that especially with monospaced, that they can have different X heights, and people will probably want to also tweak the font size of the monospaced fonts if they use a custom one, because they might say, oh, I love how it is designed, but because it has a smaller X height, I actually want to increase the font size. So that might be a follow-up request after custom monospaced fonts is custom monospaced font size, because I need to tweak that as well, or else it doesn't work for me. So it might be a lot of work in maintenance. So that goes to my questions under point C, but we can get to that after, unless anyone has other comments.
Yeah, crazy thought is if we were able to find a monospace font like variable and expose the variable options to a user to save those as a preference, that would be pretty interesting, because you could adjust weight, X height, width, all of those properties. We could still load one font, a single font, but then you could essentially tweak these things for your own preference with a variable setting. That could be pretty interesting. But anyways, I know we're at time, so I want to get to your other points, Pedro.
Yeah, point B, it's about, this was expected, big visual change, some people react negatively. We had, I don't think it was such a strong impact from when we changed Source Sans Prose to system fonts, but we also had a few complaints, especially with the fact that in many Linux distributions, the system fonts have poor design. And yeah, I'm just wondering about this idea of the user preference, because it seems that, and I was looking through the comments, weeks ago, not a lot of recent comments other than the Windows blurriness. And I was wondering if the issues that I think originated this idea of the user preference, have those initial issues, have they been addressed? And if so, how much of a priority this is, and what problems would it solve?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think I totally agree. Like most of the feedback in the feedback issue was related to the monospace font and the ligatures, like the combination of both. And that was like one of the things which got addressed pretty quickly to remove the ligatures by default. But there still are some voices, of course, which just really dislike, as I mentioned, like the JetBrains mono as a font, as a typeface, essentially, right? Yeah, so I guess both the question is, do we want to have like a fallback for those users that they can just switch back basically to what we had, just to have like the default system font as a fallback, or if we just want to move ahead and just say with all the implementation which is still due. Jeremy mentioned that this is just like the starting point of the optimizations we do. Type scale might be one, and then with like the variable font nature, we can do a lot more optimizations. So yeah, we can also look into that direction, like in just improving the fonts itself. But yeah, I think this is just like a question where we have like, we should have a stand on if we want to do it or not. So yeah.
Jeremy, do you want to add anything to what Sascha said?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just figuring out at this point, at least for me, I have these questions about how much a priority this is, and because this was expected, right? So are we do we think those problems are unexpected? And because if we were expecting some backlash, we would also, you know, kind of think, yeah, we're probably going to have a user preference because of this and that. If we weren't thinking about that, and this backlash is unexpected, or certain parts of this backlash is unexpected, do we need to give this some time for people to get used to the new fonts? Are there, you know, deep-rooted problems that we will probably need to address at some point? Yeah, I don't have a strong, you know, opinion on whether we should have user preference or not. I just want to, you know, make sure that we contain the discussion, because, you know, at least in create, in the stage that I'm in, that's usually where most of these complaints come from, and where we get people talking about the syntax highlighting themes, and I want to customize them or this or that, because that's where they see the code. And so I can, you know, yeah, just have to think about how far are we willing to go for the reach that it has, the impact that it has, and if we are, if we agree that we want to afford maintaining, you know, a user preference and all of that, if it's worth it. So yeah, I'm happy to help figure this out if you want, but yeah, I of course I trust you in your assessment.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's also where I'm a bit uncertain because, you know, I think like part of inclusive design would also give users the choice, you know, at least, you know, that they can. This is like a primary example for that, I guess, but it's also like it could be the starting point of a lot of follow-up requests, like you mentioned, Pedro, right? So it could be like just a small bit that we try to you know, like reach out to the user base, and then, you know, a ton of requests come in for like you know, like font size, or like, oh, we want to have another you know, like different monospace font we can choose from and stuff like that. So it could open the door for a lot of customizations we don't want to have in the product. But as long as we would just, you know, like say, okay, this is as far as we go, just providing you like the you know, like the fallback to what we had before, to the system fonts, and that's it. We won't do like any adjustments in size or whatever. Then I would be totally okay with it. But I think this is just like the very narrow path. You know,
Yeah.
so
And also what we were talking about, the web ID, like even if we don't want to do any of this and we say no user preference for anyone, we have the web ID based on VS Code. It has the user preference to change, you know, the theme, the fonts, everything. And yeah, I can immediately hear people screaming like, you know, it's perfect for me in VS Code, but when I go into a merge request or the repository, the code is using a different font and it doesn't make any sense. And where's the consistency? You know?
yeah, that's a fair point. You know, because like the web ID team wants to add this preference. You know, the voice could also be, okay, but you added it to the web ID. Why didn't you enable it for all the other code parts in the UI, right? It's inconsistent. So I can already hear that feedback if you would say no. But I think it's important to just, you know, like to just have like a starting and an end point to this whole thing that we can just say, okay, this is as far as we go. And maybe, you know, if you go the route in choosing, you know, like the fallback fonts, then it's maybe just not as supported as the default we provide. A lot of questions in my head, actually. But yeah, I think we will figure that out.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, so next steps. just cover that quick. GitLab UI, kind of refactor current implementation, provide utility classes. In the product, a lot of work to be done as far as removing those custom overrides, bootstrap, using utility classes. So lots to happen there. As it relates to Figma, like I mentioned, we pushed that branch today, or merged that branch, and we're going to continue to build out examples in Figma using that and explore that. And then likewise, keep an eye on the feedback issue to see what we might do. I think it'd be great to have some more conversations and maybe kind of take a tiered approach here and think about feature flags and how we might even do some testing, like provide options like, hey, if we fell back to a system font, would this be satisfactory? Or if we provided a subset of open space or open source fonts that we, you know, like a set of them that we want, you could choose, different whatever, or we provide an option that you can enter your own font stack. I think we could maybe do some testing on some of those levels to see what level, now that we know that, hey, you know what, there is an interest for the ability to customize this, like at what level would we satisfy that need most effectively for most users, right? So I think we could do some of that exploration as well. But,
Good ideas.
Sounds good to me as well.
Yeah, Pedro, again, well, and Sascha, glad to have you both back and weighing in on this, because I greatly appreciate all you have to offer for this, and it's very helpful.
Thank you for setting this up, and thank you for being open to feedback and being very thoughtful about all of these things while still maintaining speed and our focus on results.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. I'm going to end this, and hope you both enjoy your day.
Have a great day.